In my last video, I discussed some patterns I'd noticed during my time reviewing decks, and there I gave 5 common deck building mistakes that I've seen people make. However, that video only covered some of my observations, with the other thing I calculated being how often I suggested adding more of different types of cards to a deck. And, after interaction, the second most common element here is a tie between lands and ramp. To be honest, this surprised me a little, particularly the ramp part. Adding ramp feels like a somewhat dated suggestion to give somebody, a tip offered to newer players in 2018 for how to keep up with the competition and the hottest new format on the block. In 2025, card draw and synergy feel like bigger focal points for EDH critique and where players should be focusing, with a trendy hot take these days being that people run too much ramp, that the focus on ramp of the past decade has gone too far in some cases. And undoubtedly, there is probably some truth to that. Ramp has become an accepted part of basically every deck, and adding ramp to a deck without thinking about why you're adding it is both a commonplace action for people and a recipe for decks that aren't as lean and powerful as they could be. And yet, there have been 9 decks that I've seen that I thought needed more ramp as opposed to only 6 that needed more draw. So in this video, I want to get to the bottom of that discrepancy, and hopefully build a framework that can help you tell if your deck is in need of ramp, or in need of something that's not ramp. The first point that needs to be made is that ramp spells don't fulfill one single task. Rather, they perform 2 separate functions, curving out and increasing total mana quantity. Let's start with the first one of those. What I mean by curving out is deploying your cards in an order and on a timeline that lets your deck best perform its game plan in the first 5 turns of the game. If we consider a dinosaur deck as an example, most Pentalaza players would probably prefer to get him out on turn 4, since dinosaurs played after him generate extra value, and dinosaurs played before him do not. If we assume that most ramp spells ramp for a single mana, this means that we need to choose whether we want that ramp to happen on turn 1, 2, or 3, or what mixture of these values we'd prefer. Let's map out those different options. With a turn 1 ramp spell, we skip 2 mana and have turns with 3 and 4 mana in addition to the turn 4 Pentalaza. With a turn 2 ramp spell, we skip 3 mana and have a single 4 mana turn before our 5 mana Pentalaza turn. With a 3 mana ramp spell, we have 1 and 2 mana turns but skip directly to 5 without a 4 mana turn. So how do we make our decision between these different options? On a basic level, it might just be coordinating with the mana values of the non-ramp cards. If I have lots of 4-drops I like and not many 2-drops, adding a bunch of 2-cost ramp works out well. If I have some setup plays I want to make with 2 mana and not much on 3 or 4 mana, adding some 3-cost ramp likely works well with that. There are a couple other factors though, such as that some ramp will simply be better for our deck than other ramp. Ramping on turn 1 is theoretically the most mana efficient from a mana spent standpoint, but basically all 1 mana ramp will be in the form of mana dorks, which could amplify the weakness to board wipes that already exists for dinosaur decks. Meanwhile, though 3 mana ramp is less mana efficient and takes up an often contested mana slot, it's also likely to have upsides beyond just boosting us up 1 mana, and additionally might contain more cards that synergize with the rest of our game plan. If we have lots of great plays to land on 3 and 4 mana, that 1 mana dork might still be great, but it's all about weighing the risk versus the reward, and there are plenty of decks where the reward won't be great enough. One final consideration is how tap lands affect our curve. If you build the most optimized possible mana base, you could probably mostly avoid these, but this may not even be necessary. Lots of mana curves build in a bit of breathing room where they can play a tap land consequence-free, often on turn 1, but also on later turns as well. With our hypothetical dino deck, I'd expect a pretty normal curve to be nothing turn 1, a ramp spell turn 2, a 3 mana card turn 3, and Pentalaza turn 4, and that curve gives us 2 different places to play a tapped land. Budget players, rejoice! So that's curve out. The other function of mana ramp is to increase the total amount of mana a player has, agnostic to the timing of any one card. The easiest example of this is high-cost commanders. You might run some ramp to curve into it in the first place, but if you have a 6 or 7 mana commander that poses a major threat, command tax is probably going to be the bigger factor that compels you to ramp. A deck with a high 30s land count is naturally going to start missing land drops around turn 6, absent any draw or filtering, and even if you manage to hit every single land drop, the escalating cost of a commander can get pretty painful to keep forking over. So, this is the other thing ramp does. It works alongside a deck's land count to keep total mana increasing. Aside from an expensive commander, there are a few other reasons you might want to keep your mana increasing. One is that you're playing a deck with a lot of card draw and other ways to churn through your mana, but where your game plan isn't all that fast. In principle, spending more mana is a good starting point for trying to win EDH games, though there will be differences in how much mana is required to win. Some decks will be lean and proactive enough to be able to win by spending only 20 mana, where others might take 30, 40, or even more than that. If you're just getting started with a new deck, or even just getting into the format, a good starting point will be to aim high with both draw and ramp, since you might not know the amount of mana you need to win. If it ends up being higher than expected, you'll be glad to have a deck with more draw and ramp, whose game plan is volumetrically larger and prepared to play later into the game. As a final precaution, if increased maximum mana is the role of ramp you're leaning into, you're going to be best served to prioritize more permanent forms of ramp, preferably land ramp, mana rocks in a pinch, and mana dorks at your own caution. An Elvish Mystic will be great for a buttery smooth curve out, but an EDH game is a hostile climate for a squishy guy like that in the long term. So these are the reasons why you might want to play a lot of ramp in your deck, and I do think it is helpful to start by laying them out like this. However, this still leaves a couple other questions on the table. For one, how much ramp should a deck be running, assuming it wants it in the first place? Well, if we're talking about ramp for curve-out purposes, this is a thing you can quantify pretty well ahead of time. Figure out your target you're ramping to and the appropriate mana values of ramp to get you there, and then shove some values into a hypergeometric calculator. You can find such a calculator on my website, linked in description, and you can also use one built into a deck building website. Looking at my Rata deck, you can see that Architect gives a 77% chance of a ramp spell playable on turn 3 in my opening hand with 18 copies in the deck, and this is a comfortable figure for me since it's a type of card I'll always want. You can also tweak the cards drawn parameter to match the amount of cards you've seen by a turn you'll want something, though only do that if you're okay keeping hands without it. Also, if you don't want to do any math, here are some benchmarks. 18 cards of a certain role, like we see here, is a good number if you always want to see it in your opening hand and are okay getting multiple sometimes. 15 is a healthy total if it's a tool you want every game, but there's a bit of wiggle room for alternate paths, or maybe some early filtering. 12 is nice if you want a tool in most games, but have some alternate options for curving out. 9 is good if a thing is a frequent part of your curve out, but not a core part. And finally, 6 is good for if you want a thing sometimes, and 3 is good for a thing that you don't really want to draw very often at all. All of this is for the curving out purpose of ramp. For the total mana function of ramp, it's going to be easier to feel it out than anything else. My Sharuum deck's ramp suite is pretty narrow on paper, but in practice it feels like just enough to let me achieve a mana advantage in the late game, which can be really helpful for a control deck that wants to outscale opponents. Relevantly to the point here, that Goldilocks total was the product of dozens of games feeling out the deck's needs. However, that advice might not give you any helpful information in the here and now, so I'll now pivot to answering a second question that might offer a bit of insight. When does a deck not want ramp? Conveniently, the answer to this question is kind of just the inverse of the two reasons for wanting ramp I laid out earlier. Let's think about mana curve. If you're playing a deck with a lot of important low-cost plays, you might not have a turn where you even want to be playing a mana rock. I have a Maria Voltron deck that is packed with 1 and 2 mana equipment, and since I'm building around a 3 mana commander, that means my turns 1 through 3 are already spoken for. Going purely by the standard of curve out, this deck wouldn't want any ramp at all. However, I do still run a decent quantity of mostly equipment-based ramp, and that's because this deck always wants to be able to pay commander tax. My commander is a big part of my value and my plan for winning, and her Urza-like presence is massively important to the deck's mana economy. While being a 3-cost commander helps in recastability, I still like to be able to stockpile a bit of extra total mana just in case I end up needing to recast her. So this is a deck that doesn't want ramp for curve out reasons, but does want it for total mana reasons. For a point of contrast, we can think about a deck that doesn't want ramp for either of these two reasons. My Malphegor deck runs very little ramp, and looking at its game plan, it's not too hard to see why. My curve is heaviest on 3, followed by 2 mana, with most of these being either engines to build in value, or discard spells to strip resources away from opponents. Since I don't really have consistent 4 or 5 mana plays, a mana rock would do absolutely nothing for this deck's early game. Importantly, this deck also doesn't need total mana. The goal of it is to push all players, myself included, into a low resources state, and even with a draw engine or 2 up, I'm still not going to be drawing that much mana worth of stuff, since my curve is moderately low. Previous iterations of this deck had a lower land count, and ramp felt useful there for casting the commander, but I've since come to the conclusion that consistent land drops are really all that's needed to keep up with Malphegor's command tax, so the total mana reason for ramp just kind of evaporated with a few extra lands in the mix. I mentioned earlier that high counts of draw and ramp is going to be a solid starting point for a lot of decks, and that is true, but as you get a feel for a deck, you might find that your counts can be a bit lower. Maybe your deck is more efficient and simply needs less mana in general, or maybe your deck is like my Malphegor deck, not necessarily wildly fast or powerful, but also not looking to pump up the scale of its gameplay a whole lot, even in a late game scenario. As a final point, let's get back to the idea of lands being a replacement for ramp in some cases. This is an idea that has been bubbling just below the surface in EDH discourse for a few years now. A couple of extremely talented Magic players, Frank Karsten and Sam Black, have each weighed in on this relationship, and both came to the conclusion, through use of simulations or other mathematical means, that the average EDH deck would be served well to focus more on land count and less on quantity of ramp. While I would hesitate to endorse the exact numbers they've come up with, or really any exact numbers given the many layers of complexity in the Commander format, the fundamentals of the critique still hold true. A lot of ramp and a low land count is frequently a recipe for inefficiency. Now, land count is an area where a lot of Commander players have shifted in the past couple years. No longer are we in the era where 35 to 36 lands is universally accepted as a good starting point for a deck's land count. Still, the inertia of the previous eras of Commander wisdom still means that a lot of players haven't followed this shift. One might ask, are they justified in this? Well, sometimes. Some decks just don't need that many lands. They don't need much mana to do what they want to do, they have options for early filtering that can find them more lands, or their deck benefits enough from maximizing gas that it's worth it to sometimes miss a land drop. An example of this I gave in my lands video at the start of this year was pseudo-storm commanders such as Joyra Weatherlight Captain. Whether or not your deck is justified in running a lower land count for one of these reasons might not be a simple judgment to make, but here's a basic test you should start running. Whenever you miss a land drop with a piece of ramp in hand, or a piece of ramp that was recently played, make note of that. If that is happening for you every game, or even multiple times per game, that's an indication that you probably need to swap some ramp spells for some lands. Thanks for watching, and thanks to Archidekt for supporting the channel. Archidekt's tools for visualizing categories make it a lot easier to figure out questions of lands and ramp. How early does my draw and filtering come online? About that early. What does my curve look like after I cut out the instance I know I'll be using reactively rather than playing on curve? It looks like that. A link to my decks is in the description if you want to play around with these tools on decks I've built. I also want to thank my supporters, some of whom are on screen now. If you want to join this illustrious crowd, you can become a YouTube member or sign up for my Patreon. With that said, I hope you have a lovely new year. Bye!